So thank you all for your patience. We're going to start in a few more minutes. Both all of our graduate assistants and I are in the background admitting participants. So we are currently up to 90. So it probably will take a few more minutes to let everybody in. So we will be starting in a few more minutes. Thank you all for your patience and welcome. And it's such a pleasure to have you all joining us. So thank you all for your patience. We're going to start in a few more minutes. Both all of our graduate assistants and I are in the background admitting participants. Very well. So we will continue admitting some participants into the room, but we are well over 120 participants at the moment. Probably we'll have several more joining us in the next few minutes. So hello and welcome to the first of our webinar series in the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. I am Gerardo Blanco and I serve as the Associate Director for the Center. And we really very excited to see you all joining us. It's such a great pleasure to have such representation from across the United States, North America, but really across the world. At the latest version of the sign-up sheet, we had people from as close to our neighbors in Canada and Mexico, and as far as India, China, and across Europe as well. So welcome to all of you. And really for today, I'm just going to go over some of the housekeeping for our webinar. Thank you all. Everybody is muted at the moment, so thank you for helping reduce the echo and noise that way. In a few more minutes, our student Tessa will be posting a Google document in the chat. Rather than using the chat function, please use the document so that Tessa can compile your questions and comments, and she will be sharing those with me. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, I will be presenting your questions. Sometimes we'll be summarizing them to both our panelists today. So fortunately, our presenters today need no introduction. And it's such a pleasure to introduce Phil Albach, who is research professor and founding director for the Center for International Higher Education here at Boston College, as well as Professor Hans de Wit, who is director of CIHE. We are very excited to be kicking off this series of webinars with our very own colleagues, but also this is one of the many opportunities that we have for all of you to stay connected and involved with our center. One of those opportunities is, of course, through International Higher Education, our publication, and we invite you throughout the presentation to take a look at the chat. We will be posting links to our different publications, but also if you are not yet subscribed to IHE, we invite you to do that. So without further ado, I would like to, and just the format for the webinar today. Each of our presenters will have about 10 minutes for some opening remarks. I believe we will be starting with Professor Albach, who will be talking about general trends in light of COVID-19 and the crisis that it has generated. And he will be followed by Professor de Wit, who will be talking about the specific impact on internationalization. And after that, each of them will have about 10 minutes to present, and then we will be turning over to the Q&A portion of our webinar. So welcome again, and Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Of course, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to Christina, our own colleagues here, and to friends all around the world. I'm going to be really brief for a number of reasons. The main one being, I think that these sessions are most useful when they're kind of discussions with the participants all around the world to deal with the issues that you're interested in especially. And the other is, I think, to be completely honest, at least for me, much of what I'm going to say you already know, because basically everybody involved in this program is experiencing the lived reality of the so-called COVID crisis and the conditions around it. So I'll probably simply be reminding you of what you already know, and perhaps also putting things together a little bit. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the COVID crisis that we're now in, which is indeed a huge change in higher education, will end at some point in the future. And the tendency among humans is to go back to the status quo. And that's not going to happen completely, but there will be a certain element of that. So I am not among the prognosticators who thinks that higher education globally will undergo a fundamental change as a result of the COVID crisis. It's already undergoing a series of important changes, and COVID is going to push some of those along and also bring into focus a few other ones. But I don't believe that this the higher education reality post-COVID is going to be changed in any revolutionary way. So let me just mention, and we can get to these issues in the discussion later, some of the short and medium term implications, some of the longer term implications of the current reality, largely pushed by COVID, but not entirely. Okay, so there are financial problems for everybody. They will affect the financially secure institutions least, and I think they will affect probably the weaker sector of the private higher education environment, maybe most, but they're affecting everybody in different ways. So financial issues are going to be are with us and are going to be there. There's going to be there is significant stress on the academic profession, which now, pushed by, of course, the importance and necessity of people moving to a digital environment really quickly. And most of us, particularly those of a certain age, not knowing what they're doing about this. But so there are those stresses. And I think there'll be longer term pressures too on the academic profession, in part to get us more able to participate in a digitized environment, at least in part, for what we do going forward, but also maybe some reconsiderations of training for academics, evaluation for academics, and so on. I think that there is clearly an increase now in inequality in higher education all around the world, in part related to differential ability to access a digital environment, and in part for many other reasons. And I think that the students who are hit by this kind of inequality, especially students from disadvantaged socioeconomic, racial, ethnic groups, not just in the United States, but everywhere, will have we'll have problems going forward too. There's going to be, in the short run, and I think in the long run, tremendously more emphasis on the use of information technology and distance delivery of education. And at the same time, efforts to improve the technology and how it works, and improve the ability on all sides, professors, administrators, universities, students, to use that technology effectively. Is it going to mean that higher education is going to become mainly digital? In my view, no. Some other observers think that it will have a much greater implication than I do. Okay, so what are some of the longer term implications? And again, I'm just going to touch on them. Greater long-term use of distance hybrid teaching, I mentioned that. Modest increase in distance-only institutions. By the way, what's going to happen to the for-profit sector in all of this is, to me, completely unclear at this point. In my own humble personal opinion, I wish they'd all go away. That's an exaggeration, but there are certainly deep problems with that sector. I think research can become, and probably will become, more internationalized as researchers become more used to distance work, communication, and the technology becomes better for this kind of collaboration. So I think we have the possibility, and I know that Hans will be discussing this a little bit, for significantly better internationalized research. There will be significant impacts, short run, medium run, and long run, in my view, on various kinds of internationalization. And again, Hans will be dealing with that. The future of nationalism, populism in global politics is not clear, but if those trends continue as they now are, and I think that there's a good chance that at least for a while they will, that will have an impact, not clear how exactly, on higher education, and is kind of a counterforce to internationalization. I think there'll be a greatly increased pressure on the middle tier of universities all around the world that predates COVID, but I think will be pushed by it. That is, the top institutions, I think, will be more or less unscathed in the long run, but the middle tier will have significant problems. So what will not happen, in my view? Top research universities will not be dramatically changed in the long or even the medium run. The domination of the traditional leading academic systems and institutions will not be dramatically altered. COVID will not mean the rise of the South in any significant way at all. As the curriculum becomes more internationalized, the domination of current leading institutions is likely to continue, but may be changed to some extent. And for the immediate future, higher education faces some very, very difficult circumstances that we are all going to have to adjust to. I will stop there and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I will follow up, Gerardo, if that's fine, and then we can have the discussion. Bonsoir and good evening from Brittany and France, where I am located as a result of COVID-19, because I have to be locked down in Europe, and at the moment it's probably even safer in Brittany than elsewhere in France or in the Netherlands to be. So and it's a nice view outside, but you can see that. You cannot see that. Does higher education and its internationalization fall from the cliff here in Brittany? And the cliffs here are very high. No, I don't think so. I agree with Phil that the reality is that there will not be this revolutionary changes. As we have seen, for instance, in the latest issues of University World News, there are people who claim that higher education will be fundamentally changed and disappear in its current form. And we have seen that over centuries, I would say, that those claims have been made, but still higher education, together with the church, is one of the oldest institutions in the world and has never been really challenged, even not in other big crises, other pandemics, financial crises, the start of digitalization. I still remember the time that people were saying that the MOOCs were going to make the university disappear. It never has happened, and also it will not happen now. Higher education is strong in its essence and its needs, and will continue to do that. Even to a certain extent, you can say that the current situation where students are desperately, after a semester of lockdown, wanted to come back to the campuses, not only to study, but in particular also to create their own community and having parties, but having also meetings and social events around that, is an illustration of the fact that we cannot change, and we will not be able to change that environment. So I think what has been proven by COVID is the real importance of higher education as an on-site campus life experience, in particular at the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, you might see some different accents, but certainly at the undergraduate level, I think what has been proven by the past period is that higher education is alive. That doesn't mean that certain things will not change, as Phil also said, and I will focus on the internationalization of higher education. And I think there will be many changes. There will not be revolutionary changes. There will also be resistance and a trend to, as Phil said as well, to go back to business as normal. But we have to be sure that's also not possible. Like, there is not a possibility that this results in a drastic revolution in higher education and internationalization. The opposite is also not true. What we will see, that we will see changes. And the changes will be gradual, and they will be at the same time also important. And in that, we also have to understand that it is not COVID-19 only that influences those changes. It is the combination of the economic crisis that Phil has mentioned. It is the combination with the still strong nationalism and populism that is present in the world. It is the related geopolitical tensions, for instance, between China and the US and Australia as an example of that. It is the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that people are starting to resist the exclusion and the social injustice in higher education more and more. It is climate change and the sustainable development goals. So there's a whole package of developments at the same time happening now that require thinking about changing. And in that, again, the reaction will be, if there is a vaccine and that we will go, the institutional leaders and national governments want to go back to business as usual, and then they will find out that that's not possible. First of all, for the economic crisis that Phil says, the impact it will have on developing and emerging countries, but also on several institutions of higher education in the developed world. The private sector, as Phil mentioned, will be a big problem. That will have an impact on the issue of mobility. Mobility of students from the developing world and from the emerging economies will be impacted, because the rise in mobility from international students for degree programs over the past decades has been as a result of an emerging middle class in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa and the Middle East, that gave them the opportunity to go to study in the developed world and pay for the high tuitions. That impact will be enormous for at least a decade, that will influence the possibility for students to go to study in the developed world. So that has an impact on, in particular, the very expensive countries like the UK, the United States, Australia, and they will choose other ways. They choose to stay at home and go to public universities with all kinds of risks that it has, because they don't have the means to invest in it, of low quality higher education in the developing world. They will go to neighboring countries where they see opportunities at a lower cost. They will go much more to Asia than already is happening, from Africa, for instance. And so on the degree mobility, for sure, there will be impacts. Not directly, not very soon, but gradually you will see that, in particular, those people who haven't made decisions yet to go abroad will decide we cannot afford to do it. It will also have an impact on credit mobility. Credit mobility, as the traditional study abroad in the United States for a semester or a year, or even more and more shorter in the summer, and in the Erasmus schemes in Europe, that will be even more than it was already a very elitist and exclusive trend. Many people also from lower and low mid-income groups in those regions will not be able to go abroad because they cannot afford it. In particular, from the study abroad in the United States, which is basically privately funded, will be having an enormous impact. And that affects the institutions of higher education and the people working in that field enormously. In Europe, because of the Erasmus support, etc., it might be less. In the rest of the world, credit mobility was always very elitist and a small group, so they will not be impacted so much as will be the study abroad in the developed countries. What we also see as a result of that is the dominance of the Anglophone countries and parts of northwestern Europe in internationalization of higher education will be impacted, because they will not see the possibility to have international students coming to their institutions and create the revenue coming from that. And that will be for many mid-tier, as Phil says, and low-tier and smaller colleges, and some of the private public institutions in the United States that have become increasingly more dependent on tuition fees from international students will impact them. So I'm not so optimistic that they will survive, and many institutions will be in the United Kingdom and the United States, and but in particular in the United States, because of the private sector will be impacted negatively. Not the top research universities for sure. So institutions and systems, depending on those high tuition fees, I will see that they will have a challenge. With respect to digitalization, I will see an opportunity. Not in the sense that I think that digitalization will replace on-site higher education. As I mentioned before, what we see is that on-site higher education is becoming more stronger out of this whole crisis, because people feel that they need to have this community of being together on campus and study and live together. And the faculty also are very much resistant to a complete online education. But what will happen is that we see that we can use the online as a tool to create much more hybrid and blended forms of internationalization of higher education. That we can bring in faculty from abroad and students from abroad into the classroom, that we can bring in real life from abroad into the classroom. So I think the collaborative online international learning movement will be much more stronger coming out of this crisis than it already was before. And in particular, you see those trends in the developing world. In Latin America, there are many great initiatives of organizations working together, developing collaborative online international learning. You see similar trends elsewhere. So I think that will be a positive opportunity, and institutional leaders should understand that they have to support that opportunity very much. What is also interesting is that I think that what is going to change is the professional development sphere in internationalization of higher education. We have been used over the past decades to go to massive conferences of NAFSA, EAIE, etc., with 10,000 or 8,000 or 5,000 people. That is no longer the future. Universities will realize, also for economic reasons, that it is not necessary to send people always to conferences. So the conferences in real life will be much smaller. And the organizations have to replace that by much more having online opportunities for professional development, to make the cost much less for the people who are participating and for the institutions. And they have to develop a business model, how to create a new way of professional development. And it's very interesting to see that, for instance, the European Association for International Education is now trying to do that in the coming month by charging for an online event. And it will be very interesting if they will be successful. And I really hope they will be successful, because it creates for them a new opportunity to address the issues that are important. And all that mobility, digitalization will also contribute to our carbon footprint as internationalization of higher education. By traveling less, we will contribute to also the help with the whole issue of climate change. So in that sense, I see also great opportunities. Research collaboration, Phil mentioned it already. I think indeed that from the institutional perspective, research collaboration internationally will become much more important. They will see that there are opportunities. They will see that it's possible digitally to do that. And all those kind of things are very important. Everything we see now, and this event, even the webinar, is a clear example of that. We can communicate around the world at distance in a very interactive way, sometimes even much more interactive than if we would be meeting people elsewhere and travel for days. If I had to do this event in Boston, it took me 1 day to go there, 1 day to come back, and then I would probably only meet something like 50 people in Boston. Now I meet people from all over the world. So that are advantages, and that the advantages on the teaching and learning, but also in the research side, I think this creates much more opportunities. Even in a time when there is less funding for research, it makes it much more important that we work together in the research area. And the last thing is internationalization has always been very much focused on the education and the research side, on the two big tasks that higher education have. But we have paid very little attention to the third mission of the university. And I think that it is very important as a result of the COVID-19 crisis that we learn that we also have to look what is our work in teaching and in research implicating for the society. So how can we create a much more what Uwe Brandenburg, Elspeth Jones and Betty Lisk and I have been called internationalization for society, to bring in the third mission in the internationalization arena. How we can collaborate in research together to help the sustainable development goals. So that is all very important. In summary, although the challenges are enormous, the resistance to change will be high, and there's no need to think that we will have a revolution in higher education. I still think it is important that we learn lessons from this crisis and that we make reforms. In my view, revolutions and conservatism, so not doing anything, have always been a disaster. Then you really fall off the cliff. If you make reforms and you learn from crises and you learn from challenges, then you can make higher education and its internationalization much better. And I think there are many opportunities to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you both for your opening thoughts. We have a very healthy number of questions already in the queue. So the first one is from Janine GH in our chat. And this is related to the economic impact of COVID. So the question is, at a recent OECD webinar, there was, the message was that there would be a long-term adverse economic impact because of the loss of learning in primary and secondary education. What is your opinion on the economic impact for the higher education sector? So some of this has been addressed, but there might be some of the more discussion in the long-term economic impact of the learning that has been lost in the last several months.
Should I start? Just briefly, neither Hans nor I are economists, and far be it from us to disagree with the OECD supposed experts. But my own personal opinion is that, yes, the learning at K-12, and for that matter, learning in the post-secondary, it has taken a big hit from the crisis and the difficulties, despite goodwill on everybody's part, to be as effective as possible, that these things will be corrected in time and not in that long a time. And it won't be that big a crisis. What's a little less clear to me is how the direct financial problems faced by universities all around the world are going to get solved in the short and medium run, in part because there's been a huge loss of tuition revenues in many countries and so on, and in more significant part because of the economic downturn crisis that we see in almost every society, pushed forward by the COVID impact on the broader economy. About that, I don't know, and I don't think it's a particularly short and medium term favorable situation.
Yeah, also to give space to other people, I think I leave it by that. There would be much more discussion possible about it. Anyway.
So the next question is from Hakan Ergin, who is asking, do you think the pandemic will lead to the rise of branch campuses, as some students will prefer to stay home rather than study abroad?
Yeah, let me answer that, and Phil maybe add. There are a lot of people, including really great experts like Janet Yewa from the UK, who really think that transnational education will be benefiting from the COVID impact, because for that reason that Hakan Ergen says, that students want to stay at home more and still want to have a foreign degree. And so branch campuses, but also franchise operations and articulation programs might be a way forward. It's an interesting thing to think about. I mean, that rationale why it would be working is in itself correct. But at the same time, we have seen that branch campuses in particular, more than franchise operations, require a high investment from either the institution that wants to create that branch campus, or from the home country or the partner institution in the home country that wants to collaborate on that. And in the economic crisis, we can wonder if that investment is possible. We have seen that many institutions have lost a lot of money on those kind of events, and so we haven't seen a big rise in branch campuses in the past because of that economic factor. And now the economic crisis will be making it even more difficult to invest in it. So I think the word is still out, but I'm not so optimistic that that will happen as some other people claim that it will be the case.
Just to add, I completely agree with what Hans has said. The bloom in many ways was off the branch campus movement even before COVID. In other words, the numbers of branch campuses were decreasing in expansion, and there were some failures with them. And I think that that there won't be a significant growth in branch campuses. I think that, as Hans said, franchise arrangements and joint degree programs, and this will get a significant boost for the reasons in part that Hakan has mentioned in the question.
Great, thank you both. To kind of stay with this topic of collaboration, the next question has to do with the actual platforms of technology. So this question is from our colleague Takehito Kamata from Sophia University. So he would like to know about all of the different technology platforms for international collaboration, right? So how should individual scholars learn and select the new collaborative technologies and platforms that are available? I think this is a very interesting question, as we all are kind of trying to learn as we go. So any of your reflections in relation to these would be very helpful, because there are, of course, many solutions that are available now, right? Coming from things like that we kind of repurpose for collaboration, like this platform we're using, Zoom, but there are also other platforms, right? Specifically intended for international collaboration. So we look forward to both your thoughts on this.
Well, just a brief comment from me. This is a really interesting and important point, and I think points to the importance of creating some kind of evaluation mechanism to where experts will tell us what's good, what's bad, what's cost effective, and so on. And of course, there are many for-profit and a few not-for-profit initiatives in this area. And wherever all this, this is the Wild West, if you will, of development in this area. So we need, the questioner is just having a great point. We need some way of evaluating it, and we don't have that at the moment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Phil. I mean, like everybody else of you receive now a lot of emails for all kind of publishing companies and technology companies who advertise that they have the best platforms and the best training opportunities how to deal with this issue. And that's what always happens when there is a new development. The Wild West, as Phil defines this, is trying to make a business out of it. And we have to be very careful because there's no perfect platform. I mean, we now use Zoom, but I'm constantly in 4 or 5 different platforms for communications, and some of them are good and others are bad, and some are more okay or okay. But there's a Wild West, and we as in higher education in this still neoliberal environment that we outsource those things. And maybe it should be much more good that higher education sectors around the world get together and say, let's create our not-for-profit own platforms, how we collaborate in research, how we collaborate in teaching, etc., instead of being depending on this whole Wild West of a technology industry that only thinks about making money and not about how to provide the best way of interaction.
Yeah.
Great. So to stay with the topic of the economic impacts, Molly McSweeney is asking whether you anticipate also any changes within country in terms of student recruitment and enrollments.
It's an interesting point. What we see now is that in many countries, the number of students are increasing. And that's always when you have an economic crisis and when you have no jobs available, then the young generation starts to go to have education again. That's a very natural reaction, and that's also what we see in many countries. The big challenge is in the countries with high tuition fees and high costs, because there the problem is that they cannot enter into the high tuition fee place. So the United States is a very clear example where there is a problem. So what we see probably there, that community colleges will be much more benefiting from that than the research universities will be because of affordability. But I think the public sector in general, and in a recent contribution to the Times Higher Education, I mentioned that Germany, for example, is a good example where the public sector is much more able to respond to the crisis than the private sector in the UK or in the United States or in Australia, which I think is an opportunity for them, because although they also will see budget cuts because of the economic crisis, the impact will be far less because the public sector wants to remain a higher education system. So I think the number of local students will indeed increase, but in particular to low-cost opportunities. And what that will mean for the developing world, for Africa and Latin America, where there is a much more private higher education sector, I think there is a risk there, because that private higher education sector, which is of low quality, is cheap and affordable, but it continues to be low quality, where the public sector does not have the absorption capacity to attract more local students. And the better private sector, for instance, the Catholic universities, will be too expensive. So I think it will result overall in a lower quality of higher education around the world, but more students.
So the next question really is very connected to this part of the discussion, and it's coming from our very own Rebecca Schendel. And the question is, it seems as though in-person higher education will increasingly become the purview of the elites who can afford it. Would you agree that increased ratification is also likely another impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think both of us will have a little bit to say about that. My own view is, I don't think, I think that in-person higher education will continue to be both for the elites and the non-elites, that people just want it. And there'll probably be some increase in distance, especially for a mass audience, but it's not going to dramatically change for anybody. But I do agree that if we don't pay careful attention for financial reasons, largely unrelated to COVID, but well related to COVID indirectly because of the economic crisis, that the inequalities which we already see dramatically in higher education, almost every place in the world, will get worse. And part of it is this public-private issue that Hans mentioned in his response to the last questioner, and partly to the broader economic crisis, and partly just to highly unfortunate public policies which exist so many places in the neoliberal environment.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's indeed what I said in answer to the previous question. The top quality universities will be much more elitist than they were already before. And the other ones, the poor quality institutions, will be even of poorer quality. So the distinction between them will increase radically as a result of this. There's no doubt about that. That has been happening in every other previous crises that have been there. And this will be accelerated in the current situation even more.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to overemphasize the poor quality. I mean, if you look at the United States, and if you look at the Netherlands and such places, the sort of mass access sector hasn't significantly deteriorated in quality, and in some senses gotten a little better. So it's a mixed bag across the world.
Yeah, but I was in particular referring to the emerging and developing world.
Yes.
There it's going to happen. So even there will be much more a distinction as well.
Yes,
between,
and with that, I entirely agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question has a regional focus. This is coming from Maria Cristina Parra Sandoval, and she is asking, how do you see the collaboration between, or rather among institutions in Latin America in terms of improving precisely the quality of teaching and learning? So what opportunities are you seeing, maybe are you hearing about across different universities in the region?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I've always said that the problem in particular in Latin America is, but also we see that in Africa to a certain extent and in Asia, is that they have always been looking too much in collaboration with the developed world, with North America and Europe, and have not been focusing on collaboration among themselves, and by that have continued to keep the dependency alive. And will this crisis change that? I hope so. I hope that they will realize that they should not continue this dependency of the power relation with the developed world, but developing their own collaboration within the region and also between the three regions. We do, by the way, collaborate with funding from the Carnegie Corporation on the collaboration between Latin America, Africa, and Asia as a kind of how can we increase that collaboration, which I also think is important. But for Latin America in itself, I think the lessons should be learned. They have to collaborate together much more. And I mentioned already the first example, which I saw that now on the collaborative online international learning, institutions of Latin America have decided we're not doing a collaborative online international learning only with Europe and with the United States. No, we start to develop collaborative online international learning among ourselves and create mechanisms also how to, by that, make it much more affordable, not charging fees among these others. So there are opportunities, and it is important that organizations in Latin America dealing with internationalization of higher education, but also institutional leaders and governments start to realize there is an opportunity for much closer collaboration and less dependency on the developed world.
So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm going to have to start maybe summarizing or grouping together some of the questions. But I think the next question may be very interesting for our audience today, and it really has to do with the role and the impact of faculty members. So the question is, and I think we can have comment from both our presenters today. The question is, currently faculty members are experiencing at least two challenges. One is adapting to new ways of teaching, right? All the platforms on Zoom and WebEx and so on. And at the same time, sort of competition for training by online providers such as Coursera, but there are many other examples as well, right? Some of these certificates that in a way are competing with the traditional work of faculty members. What should be the role of faculty under these circumstances?
Well, that's a very important question. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that one of the results of COVID is increased pressure on the academic profession in many, many ways. And we still have to figure out how faculty members can do that. I think faculty need to represent themselves to their institutions and so on, either through faculty senates or through collective organizations that they have in some countries, to make sure that their interests are reflected. At the same time, faculty members need to understand that the environment is changing and that the faculty needs to change to some extent as well.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I mean, in this whole discussions about the impact of COVID-19, we see a lot of attention by governments and institutional leaders, and we don't hear much of the voice of faculty and students. We will have in one of our upcoming issues in International Higher Education an article by William Locke from from Melbourne University in Australia about exactly that topic, that all those people who think that the future of higher education has to change fundamentally does not take into account the role of faculty and of students and their opinion about it. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, I think that's what we learned from this crisis, that students and faculty have a different opinion than others about the importance of having a community together. So faculty are very important, but at the same time, I also agree with Phil that faculty have to learn that there are opportunities there that they should not resist to. Faculty are also the ones that are most resistant to change. They are resistant to change also on internationalization. They think that internationalizing the curriculum is not necessary, it's an extra burden for them, they're not open to it, they are resisting to digitalization, but they have to change in that sense also to say, well, okay, we need to modernize, our students are more modern than we are, and if we want to keep path with the students, then we have also to invest much more in their role and in our role in higher education. So faculty are very essential, but faculty also have to realize that that makes them necessary to change as well.
And if I may make one other comment, which actually relates to Hans's home country, the Netherlands. I just saw an article today in the Times Higher Education that the Minister of Education of the Netherlands says, I was shocked, says that we have to be concerned in Holland that we're not overworking the faculty so that they can do their work during a normal work week and not have to work on the weekends on their research. I find that a completely revolutionary thing, and I'm sorry I'm not Dutch, and I'm not 50 years younger than I already am.
But she also said that it will take at least 10 years before that will be accomplished. And even then, I doubt that it will happen. So as I said, revolutions are not always successful. I don't think this revolution will be either successful.
So please let me ask you, Hans and Phil, would you rather me asking one final question from the audience, or would you rather share some closing reflections just based on this very stimulating conversation? Next time we will plan for 2 hours. So let me know, what would you rather do?
A question, right, Hans?
Yeah, agree.
Very good. So now it's on me to pick the one last question. So no pressure on this. I guess to continue the debate, there are two questions that really stood out for me. I have in front of me at the moment. One of them is more a commentary related to STEM collaboration and the increasingly restrictive policies that we have in the United States. And a very closely related question by a different member of the audience has to do with precisely research collaboration, using specifically China and the United States as examples. But do you both anticipate that the pandemic will have an effect on research collaboration among researchers from different countries? What can we expect for the short term, and what are we observing at the in the current moment?
Well, there are two issues, and let me start. Hans can go on. One of them is the kind of U.S., and you might add a little bit Britain and Australia. All three countries have problems with China at the moment, and at the same time, China has problems with us. So it's an unfortunate two-way street, and all of this is pushed not by the academics, but by governments. And if the current political trends in the three countries I mentioned on the Western side continue, and if the current political trend on the China side also continues, there will be big, significant hits to international collaboration in research, and by the way, on mobility and other things too. The other part of the question is, I think COVID will stimulate even more a trend already going on, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the increased sophistication of the technology will also help international collaboration and research broadly. So two separate things: China, West on one hand, and broad issues on the other.
Yeah, thank you. And just very brief, because we are running out of time. Phil and I can refer to an upcoming blog in University World News exactly on that topic, as we were requested to write. And but I think Phil is putting the essence. If you look at the political side, there is a tendency to anti-collaboration and research around the world. And if you look at the academic side, then there is a positive attitude to much more research collaboration. That tension will continue. Funding will also be a factor there. We see that, for instance, in the negotiations about a deal within the European Commission, research funding was going down, where the opposite should exactly happen to make it possible to find a solution with a vaccine, is to invest more in research and in future pandemics. So that tension of funding, that tension of geopolitical challenges is contradicting the increasing importance that we see to solve the issues of the world by research collaboration. And it's interesting to see, if you look at the vaccines, for instance, it is an international environment. The companies that are working on it are international multinationals. The researchers are in international teams. The testing finds place in different countries of the world. The production finds place in India or whatever. And so there's all the signs that you cannot solve these issues without international collaboration. But for some reason, governments with a nationalist perspective don't see that, or even don't want to tell the public that that's the only way forward.
What a great way to bring kind of round up this webinar. Before I have the unfortunate task of bringing this webinar to an end, I just wanted to invite everybody in our audience to stay connected with our center. So I have included in the chat the link for our next events. So our very next event in October is going to be our 2020 digital seminar. And this is in lieu of the face-to-face meeting we were planning to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the Center for International Higher Education. That meeting has been postponed for 1 year, but we will have this virtual engagement opportunity. And our next webinar is going to be on November 17th by Huiyan Ye, who is a visiting scholar here in our center with the topic of liberal arts education in East Asia. So we hope you will be able to join us. Also, we have included in the chat the link to subscribe to our flagship publication, International Higher Education. So that being said, feel free to stay connected with us, our upcoming events and publications. And once again, thank you both to Phil and Hans for this very engaging discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to having you be part of upcoming events. Thank you and take care.